begin with Old Testament, Numbers 13, 1 through 2, and then 13, 26 through 14, to chapter 14, verse 11. 10 of the 12 men sent to spy out the land of Canaan discouraged the Israelites from wanting to invade and occupy the promised land. Only Joshua and Caleb had faith. The Lord said to Moses, "Send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders." They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account: "We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev, the Hittites, Jebusites, and the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan." Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do that." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." That night, the people of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt or in this desert. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will swallow them up. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." But the whole assembly talked about stoning them. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the miraculous signs I have performed among them?" The next lesson is from the New Testament. It is from Philippians 2, 12 through 18, and it's in the Pew Bible on page 831. Sorry about that. Pew Bible 831. Our positive Christian attitude should cause our witness to stand out all the more in the midst of sinful people. "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but how much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. Do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure children of God, without fault in a crooked and depraved generation, in which you shine like stars in the universe, as you hold out the word of life, in order that I may boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor for nothing. But even if I am even being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and the service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. Please rise for the reading of the gospel from Mark 9:14 through 24. It is in the Pew Bible, page 714. Mark 9:14 through 24, page 714. Jesus heals a demon-possessed boy. When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. "What are you arguing with them about?" he asked. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." "O unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him, and when the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," said Jesus, "everything is possible for him who believes." Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." That ends the readings. You may be seated.
Set out from Mount Sinai. They were there for over a year. They were in Egypt for some 400 years, and finally when Moses came to deliver them, he brought the plagues from the Lord, the plagues, the judgments against Egypt's gods and against Pharaoh that finally convinced Pharaoh to let the people go. And that whole process took some time, probably close to several months. And then they crossed the Red Sea and camped at Mount Sinai. And while they were there, Moses got the 10 Commandments from the Lord. He came down and found the Israelites worshiping idols just, weeks after the Lord had spoken directly to the whole crowd, saying, among other things, don't worship idols. Moses broke the 10 Commandments and ground the idol into dust and made the Israelites, threw the dust in the water and made the Israelites drink the dust, some of which was gold dust. As a reminder not to do that anymore, which evidently they had problems with through their whole history. They still going back to idols, but that's another story. Moses went back up on 40 days again. Moses twice was on the mountain in the Lord's presence for 40 days, fasting the whole time while he spoke with the Lord face to face and got the 10 Commandments that the Lord actually wrote in stone with his own finger. And so Moses brought the law back down. Part of that was instructions, how to worship, how to build the tabernacle, which was a earthly copy of God's presence, God's tabernacle in heaven, the heavenly temple. That's what the tabernacle was patterned after. So they built the thing, they built the tabernacle, instituted the priesthood, and began worshiping there. And then finally it was time for the Israelites to travel on. Time for them to go to the promised land. But the longest journey begins with a single step, but for the Israelites, the longest journey is constantly interspersed as well. So you take a step, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, that step back being a complaint. Later on in Numbers 14, after where our reading left off, the Lord was going on and talking about the Israelites to Moses, saying, "These people have tried me and tempted me 10 times. And if you're following the Walk Through the Bible book that we have, it's actually got a list of 10 specific occasions. Now, sometimes 10 can be a symbolic number in the Bible, but the Israelites had very publicly and very vocally complained at least that many times. Kind of like the Saturday night bath, it's complaining against God once a week whether we need it or not. But that's part of their character. Even though these were the very people that had seen the plagues. They had seen the water of the Nile turn to blood. They had seen livestock die. They had seen boils form on the people. And many of those plagues happened only to the Egyptians and didn't touch the Israelites at all. They had seen how the angel of death passed over their houses when they painted the lamb's blood on the doorway. And yet the firstborn of the Egyptians were all killed, both of man and beast. They had seen the Red Sea parted. Were there anxious moments? Of course there were. They were surrounded by water and desert and by Pharaoh's army. And yet God always made a way. When they were in the desert, God gave them food. God gave them water. And then God finally gave them his laws. And they had been provided for, taken care of, as no other people in the history of the face of the earth from day one. And yet, a part of their journey, a major part of their journey, was the constant grumbling and complaining that they did. And it was no different when they got to the very door of the promised land. They sent out these, we call them spies, to reconnoiter the land, to bring back a report of the good land the Lord was giving them. And we can't forget, this was not just an aside. This was not just peripheral, this is the land you're getting. That was part of the deal from the time of Abraham. Way back in Genesis 15, God had promised that very land. And he told them that these people were going to be in the land and they would take the land over from them. And yet God told Abraham it won't happen for a while because the sin of these people was not yet completed. In other words, God was bringing Israel into the land not only to give the land to them, but also to punish the wickedness of the idolatry and the adulteries and all the wickedness that was going on in the land. That was Israel's purpose from the beginning. And yet when they got to the land, the spies realized, yes, it is a good land, but they were afraid. The cities were large. Some of the walls were as much as 20 feet thick, we read from archaeology magazines. They can still find the ruins of some of those cities, and they did have high walls. And there were armies in the land, of course. But what was the key issue? Did they believe God's word? Did they believe what the Lord had told them from the beginning, that the land was theirs for the taking? Did that mean everybody would run away as soon as they heard the Israelites were at the border? Not necessarily. Egypt, Pharaoh didn't just meekly let the Israelites go. He resisted. But God was on their side. Sometimes our faith takes perseverance to see it through to the end, whatever the project is. That doesn't mean God doesn't want us to succeed. But it does mean we have to have a certain tenacity, a certain inner strength to carry us through the project, whatever it is that God calls us to do. As the spies gave their report, I think it's interesting to just to take it point by point and see their objections, what they were exactly objecting against going in the land. They said, "We went in the land and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is the fruit, but the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large." And again, that's not a news flash. That was not a surprise. But so what? Where did they just come from? Egypt. a land with bigger fortresses, a stronger army, and more people than Canaan ever thought about having. And yet they had forgotten that God had no problem delivering them from that. We even saw descendants of Anak there, and later on they talked about the Anakites and the Nephilim. The Nephilim were these giants, the heroes in the days of old. We go back to Genesis 6, men of legendary stature that were wiped out in the flood, supposedly. And these people living in the land of Canaan were supposed to be some of those people. It's like, well, we can't stand against them. They're bigger than we are. Well, if God can defeat the chariots of Egypt, then what's the problem with people, whether they're big or small or short or tall or whatever? They just didn't think about these things. There were Amalekites living there. And here their memory was even shorter. They had already left the Egypt. They had already crossed the Red Sea. They were on their way to Mount Sinai. And some Amalekites had actually attacked Israel while they were marching in the desert. And yet Moses and Joshua led Israel in a defeat of the Amalekites, a resounding defeat. It was the story where Aaron and Hur held up Moses' hands. When they held up his hands, Joshua was winning. When Moses got tired and let his hands drop, the Amalekites started winning. So they let Moses sit down, and Aaron and Hur held up Moses' hands, and the Amalekites were defeated. And they were afraid of the Amalekites now? And all those other ites that lived there. It was absolutely senseless. These are the very people that God had promised they would dispossess. In fact, they often fought with each other. And the spies then said, after Caleb broke in and said, well, we should go up and take possession. We can do it. Vote of confidence, a vote of faith. But the spies came back and said, no, we can't attack them. They are stronger than we are. And they may have indeed physically been stronger. But again, they were forgetting whose people they were and whom they were supposed to be serving. In 2 Kings chapter 6, when some men of Syria came to take Elisha captive, Elisha's servant was afraid. He saw the chariots, the soldiers of the enemy army, and said, oh my gosh, Elisha, what are we going to do? And Elisha said, don't worry, those who are with us are stronger than those who are with them. And then he prayed to the Lord, Lord, open my servant's eyes. And the servant's eyes were opened, and he looked out again, and he saw the chariots of God with angels surrounding Elisha's house. There's no way those Syrian soldiers stood a chance. And John reminds us in his first letter in the New Testament, greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. If you're on the Lord's side, if you trust in the Lord Almighty, there is no enemy greater than God that can stand against you. There is nothing coming from the outside. And that bit from Romans 8, what can separate us from the love of Jesus? Nothing. Nothing can. And then the Israelite spies back in Numbers 14 went on to say, the land devours those who are in there. It's like, well, if that's so true, then why are these enemies so strong and powerful that we can't conquer them? They were letting fear take hold of not only their emotions, but their mind as well. And fear will do that. It makes us not think. And they said, the spies said, we looked like grasshoppers to them, and that's how we looked in their eyes as well. And my next question would be, well, how do you know? Did you ask them? Again, the Lord proves himself to be strong on our behalf when we trust in him. During the time of a drought, again, later in Israel's history, and again during Elisha's time, actually it was a time of war and famine. And the city was being besieged by the enemy army, Syrians again. And the people were starving. They were reduced to cannibalism to survive. And there were 4 lepers that lived outside of the city. And they were about to starve like everybody else. And finally they said, well, we don't have anything to lose. We're going to die anyway. So let's go to the Syrians and beg for mercy. And maybe they'll at least give us something to eat so we don't die. So the 4 guys were walking out to the Syrian camp. Who knows what happened next? Anybody remember that story? The Lord made those 4 guys' footsteps sound like the armies of Egypt coming. And the Syrians fled and left everything, absolutely everything, even hardly the clothes that they brought along. And certainly they left all their food. And the famine was averted the next day. All the people of the city had to do was go out and collect the food. God works on his people's behalf. And the Israelites knew that, but they had forgotten. They'd forgotten. God had promised them the land. They forgot. During their hard times, during their times of testing, they forgot what God had already done. They forgot that victory is not won without a struggle. God gives us faith and God gives us victory, but in the meantime, to connect those dots between faith and victory, we have to walk, we have to follow in his steps wherever he leads. They forgot that complaining wasn't really part of the deal. And we think, God was awfully severe with those people about just complaining. We kind of put that on the catalog or on the list of little sins. Complaining, that's not a big thing like adultery or worshiping idols or murder or something like that. But if we read in 1 Corinthians 10, if you look at the heading of that section of Scripture, it says warnings from Israel's history. And Paul takes these very same Israelites, the Israelites under Moses, and gives some examples of what they did, things that we need to learn from. He says, these things occurred as examples. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in pagan revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. We should not test the Lord, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. And so we see Paul here doesn't regard grumbling and complaining as a small thing, but they suffered many multiple deaths from that, just the same as they did from idolatry. Why? Well, what is complaining and grumbling besides annoying to people that are listening? What does it do? It puts us all in the same boat, it does, but it's a boat going the wrong way. It's a boat being carried down toward the waterfall and over the edge. Nothing good is going to ever come from it. It's kind of like worry, and I remember reading Norman Vincent Peale. He kind of analyzed what worries are, and he said that 80% of what we worry about never happens. And most of the rest of it is stuff that we can't do anything about anyway, or it's in the past. So there's like 2 or 3% of stuff that we worry about that we might actually have opportunity to affect. But most of us can handle most of those things, and if we can't, again, God can. But complaining and grumbling, what is that? Well, first of all, it's disagreeing with God. That's what it really is. Or it's judging God. God, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. As if we know better what we need. As if God isn't doing a good job of taking care of us. As if God doesn't know what's going on or is not able to save us. And when we think about that, when we realize that that's what complaining is, it's really setting ourselves up against God. All of a sudden it looks like it's kind of a major sin after all, isn't it? It is idolatry, just like greed. And so God was judging the Israelites fairly when they complained over and over and over again. They had forgotten the bitterness of slavery. They were hungry, they were thirsty, they were uncomfortable in the desert, they were afraid of the people, and they wanted to go back to slavery? Well, how miserable was that? Again, the short memories brought on by fear. And God was, in fact, in their very midst, even as He is in our midst, but even visibly for them. They had the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire by night to remind them every day that God was with them. And there was Moses, a living reminder. Numbers chapter 12, just days before the current readings episode, there was a little struggle between Moses and Aaron and Miriam. Aaron and Miriam began complaining too. You see, that's kind of contagious. It's like the flu or something else. And just as bad for our souls. And the result of that was that Miriam got leprosy. So complaining never works, but Moses there was the reminder. He was vindicated right in front of the people as God's representative for those people. And all they had to do was look at Moses, and they knew they should follow the Lord because of all the things Moses had led them through. Well, the obvious lesson is don't complain. We read that in Philippians, our second reading. Do everything without complaining and arguing. There are not very many things that are more effective in making our witness noticeable than being a person full of joy and hope and peace who does not complain. When Paul compared our lives as shining like stars in a dark night sky, I think we would agree, if we think about it, that someone who doesn't complain is like that. They do stand out. They stick out like a sore thumb, or like those stars in the sky. So it's part of our witness that we not complain. It's a choice between faith and fear. And I think we know what Jesus told us about that. In Matthew chapter 6, he kind of summed it up when he said, "Seek first the kingdom of God, and all these other things of life will be added unto you. They'll be given to you." If you put God first, in other words, He'll put you first. He'll take care of you. He'll give you everything you need to do what He wants you to do. Worry is just another form of fear. Complaining, in a sense, goes in that same category of fear. So go with faith instead. And then we need to remember God doesn't lie. He always keeps His word. In Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 11, the Lord told the prophet, "I am always watching to see that my word is fulfilled." And later on in Numbers, Balaam the prophet, who was hired by a pagan king to come and worship the Israelites, he came down and blessed the Israelites because he listened to God, and God reminded him that God is not a man that He should lie. In fact, it's incapable for God to lie. And Jesus Himself said, "I came to fulfill the law." Jesus is the way and the truth and the life. And then there's our human tendencies, that we maximize our problems and minimize God. We make a mountain out of a molehill. We're pretty good at that as human beings. That's our nature. But we should kind of switch that around and minimize our problems while we maximize God. Again, if God is bigger than any problem, why not go with God instead of with the problem? Why embrace the problem? But embrace God who can solve all of our problems. When King Ahaziah got sick, he sent prophets to another town to consult Baal. And Elijah met those envoys, those messengers, and said, "Go tell the king this. Is it because there's no God in Israel that you send messengers to this idol?" Or when the angel came to Mary with the Annunciation, and she asked, "How in the world can I bear a son when I'm not even married?" And the angel said, "Nothing is impossible with God." And Jeremiah, in chapter 32, when the Lord told him to buy fields even on the eve of Judah's conquest, Jeremiah made this confession, "Ah, sovereign Lord, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you." If God can create everything, certainly he can do whatever it is I need for him to do in my life. And later on in the same chapter, the Lord said, "I am the Lord, the God of all mankind. Is anything too hard for me?" And of course, the obvious answer is no. And then finally, as with the Israelites, so with us. Do not forget God. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, where the Lord gave Moses, and Moses gave Israel then the great commandment, "Hear, O Lord, the Lord your God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and all your mind and your strength." And then Moses went on to say this, "These commandments are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates." In other words, do everything you can to remind yourselves of what God has done for you. Because we need that reminder. As people, we're not different from the Israelites. Our tendency is to forget all those good things that God has done in our past. Now, we may not have crossed the Red Sea on dry land. We may not have been at the foot of Mount Sinai. But we've been places that the Israelites haven't been. We have all of history's testimony of how good God has been for us. And we have crosses all around to remind us of what Jesus did for us, the most supreme sacrifice of all. God showed his love in this, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Always do what it takes to remind yourself of who God is and what he has done for you. And then it will be easier to count your blessings day by day, that you might remain faithful, standing on the promises of God. So let's sing that hymn now, standing on